So before we start with any topic, as is tradition, we will look at the previous year questions and analyze what they have asked. So in left-wing extremism, some questions have been asked. 5 questions have come in the last 10 years, which means that there is a high probability that this topic will get repeated. So let's look at the questions. Article 244 of the Indian Constitution relates to the administration of scheduled areas and tribal areas. Analyze the impact of non-implementation of the provisions of 5th schedule on the growth of left-wing extremism. So here I have understood that 5th schedule and left-wing extremism is something I need to know in detail. Let's look at the next question. The persisting drives of the government for development of large industries in backward areas have resulted in isolating the tribal population and farmers who face multiple displacements. So just by reading this part, I need to know about the displacement that has happened in industrial or mineral-rich areas. Then it says, with Malkangiri and Naxalbari foci, discuss the corrective strategies needed to win the LWE doctrine-affected citizens back into the mainstream of social and economic growth. So here I understand two other things. One, that there is a LWE doctrine. And how I can win back my own citizens who have been afflicted by this doctrine back into the mainstream. This I need to know, right? There are also two examples here, Malkangiri and Naxalbari. So these two things I need to know, right? At least one of these I need to know in detail. Now, left-wing extremism is showing a downward trend, but still affects many parts of the country. Briefly explain the Government of India's approach to counter the challenges posed by LWE. So firstly, I need to know what challenges LWE poses, right? And then I need to know Government of India's approach. With me so far? Now, what are the sound determinants of left-wing extremism in eastern part of India? So determinants of left-wing extremism is also something I need to know. So drivers and determinants becomes another keyword that I need to know about. Let's say drivers. Then, what strategy should the Government of India? Same question as before. 1. Civil administration 2. So now in my strategy, I need to have this separately. Civil administration needs to come separately in my answer. And security forces 3. So even security forces need to come separately in my answer. What strategy should the Government of India, civil administration and security forces adopt to counter the threat in these affected areas? Correct? Then, last question that has been asked in 2022 was, Naxalism is a social, economic and developmental issue. So I need to know these dimensions, that how social exclusion leads to Naxalism, how economic exclusion leads to Naxalism, how developmental deficit leads to Naxalism, manifesting as a violent internal security threat. So in the question itself, they have told us that internal security threat of Naxalism is actually a developmental problem, not a internal security problem alone. It is a developmental problem in the background, emerging as an internal security threat. In this context, discuss the emerging issues. So some emerging issues, some new issues I need to know about. For example, the new areas of Maoist presence, the idea of women coming to the red corridor, this I need to know about. And suggest a multi-layered strategy to tackle the menace of Naxalism. Now, this multi-layered strategy is effectively again the same question that was asked last year. If I know the Government of India's approach, civil administration's approach, and security forces approach, I will be able to write a multi-layered strategy to tackle the menace of Naxalism. So from this analysis and from my own understanding, what do I understand? I understand that if I have to read the topic of left-wing extremism, I need to know, one, what basically is Naxalism, how this movement has evolved. Now, this has not been asked before. But without knowing this context, I will not be able to understand the movement in detail. Then what are the drivers? This has been asked before, and without understanding the causes of Naxalism, no other thing can be understood. Then how do I counter left-wing extremism? What has the government done so far? What could possibly be a multi-pronged strategy or a multi-layered strategy? And what is the way forward? This dimension I need to know. Now, other than this, there are some other things. So there is the talk of the fifth schedule and Naxalism. So this I need to know in detail. Forest policy, although not asked expressly, is a key driver of Naxalism. So if in a case the question comes in environment on forest policy, I need to know the Naxal context. And if it comes in internal security, I need to know the forest policy context. Then I need to know about Salva Judum. This I will explain in detail in class today, but you will understand how this fits into where the government has gone wrong in countering left-wing extremism. And finally, the case studies, other examples and value addition is something I need to add. Specifically, the case study of Naxalbari must be here, right? First, we will start with the drivers of Naxalism. When we are reading drivers of Naxalism, we will understand the causes of Naxalism in detail. From these causes, we will also get a small idea of certain solutions that could be done. And we will also understand what the movement effectively is. So the order in which we are going to go is we are first going to understand the drivers of Naxalism. Then we are going to understand what the movement is. We're going to understand what could be the possible solutions. From after this, we're going to read the evolution of the movement. Then we're going to read how the government is currently countering left-wing extremism. Then what a multi-pronged strategy could be, and then these dimensions. So it will be holistically covered and nothing will be left. So let's start with the drivers of Naxalism. पहले हम समझते हैं कि नक्सल मूवमेंट है क्या. Not the official MHA definition. हम MHA definition भी देखेंगे. But let's understand what this problem effectively is. Ultimately, ये लोग कौन है? They are our own citizens who have now picked up guns against the state. So, if they have picked up violent means against the state, they are effectively terrorists. No sympathy for the Naxal cause, right? We have to understand the reasons, but इनके लिए कोई sympathy नहीं रखनी है, right? Just telling you in detail, right? So, they are our own citizens. They have picked up guns against the state. But there is also a set of citizens in India that are giving these citizens with guns, or rather these terrorists, legitimacy. If there was no legitimacy to this movement by the citizens of our own country, this movement could not have sustained for a period of 60 years, right? तो कुछ हमारे citizens इन्हीं को legitimacy दे रहे हैं. क्यों? When we are understanding the drivers, we will see that ultimately the only driver of Naxalism is governance and a developmental vacuum. मैं आपको सारे ड्राइवर्स डिटेल में बताऊंगा, बट यू विल अंडरस्टैंड दैट वेरेवर देयर इज अ गवर्नेंस और डेवलपमेंटल वैक्यूम, राइट? Basically what I'm saying is state has certain responsibility to govern well. When state does not perform this responsibility properly, एक vacuum बन जाता है. Now this vacuum gets occupied by the left-wing extremists. And since the common citizens are frustrated with the state, they are gravitating towards this ideology. इस पे हमने क्वेश्चन भी देखा कि इंडस्ट्रियल ड्राइवर से क्या हो रहा है? डिस्प्लेसमेंट. इंडस्ट्रियल ड्राइव होती है, डिस्प्लेसमेंट होती है, पीपल गेट डिसअफेक्टेड एंड देन दे गो इनटू द लेफ्ट विंग एक्सट्रीमिज्म डॉक्ट्रिन. जितने भी ड्राइवर्स हम पढ़ेंगे, in all of them you will see that there is actually a governance vacuum, a developmental vacuum, and this vacuum is then being occupied by the left-wing extremists, and then our common citizens are giving them legitimacy, leading to persistence of the movement. Now let us see the drivers in detail. पहला driver है land-based issues. Now, there is three types of land. There is government land, there is private land, and there is forest land. Okay. Now think about the tribal regions of India where all three of these lands exist. In terms of private land, what has been the promise of the state? The promise of the state has to do land reforms, to give land to the tiller. Now, we know largely that this has not been successful in all parts of India. It has especially not been successful in the Naxal affected areas. Now, what happened was that the government promised that we will give land to the tiller, but our land reforms were largely unsuccessful in this manner, especially with regards to landless laborers and sharecroppers. Now, when this was happening, the Naxals come in and through violent means, this same strategy of land to the tiller is also adopted by the Naxals. But here, they use violence. Whenever they see that there is a big landlord, okay, or they see someone who is not that big a landlord, but they are someone who is against the Naxals, through violence, they intimidate these people, right? So let's say there is a landlord. The Naxals will, through violence, intimidate this person and ask him to leave his land. Okay. Now, once he leaves his land, the Naxals will then try to redistribute this land to the landless people. Right? But ab kya? Now what happens is that we have a state machinery. We have the police. The police sees that this action, because done through violence and not done through legal means, is an illegitimate action. So police repression happens not on these people. I mean, it obviously happens on the Naxals, but it also happens on these landless people. So laws like Prevention of Terrorism Act, which is a preventive detention law, is imposed on these landless laborers, and they are locked up. Now, what happens to this landlord? This landlord is afraid of the Naxals because they are violent. So he says, I am voluntarily ready to give up my land. He says to the state that I will do voluntary redistribution of my land. But the problem is the state cannot allow this because this would give legitimacy to Naxal violence. So he's scared of the Naxals. He's voluntarily ready to give his land, but we can't allow that. So the big landlord does not come back to his land, and ultimately his land stays fallow. The landless laborers are afraid of police repression, so they don't work on this land. What then happens is that there is wastage of a perfectly good economic resource. Wastage of this particularly good economic resource translates to poverty in the region. Then further, the Naxal cause is strengthened. Now, this is effectively the private land issue. The state had to do land reforms. The state did not do land reforms and leave a governance vacuum. Naxals then come in and fill that governance vacuum. So the landless laborers and poor sections of the society give them legitimacy. But the problem remains unsolved because it is viewed as a law and order problem and not a developmental problem. Police come in and police start repressing these people, which leads to further grievances with the state, further developmental vacuum, and continuing the vicious cycle of Naxalism. This is the first driver in terms of private land. The second problem here is of government land. Because Naxals have no respect for the state machinery, what they do is they try and encroach government land. Through this encroachment, they are again going back to the idea of land to the tiller. So, with violent means, they encroach government land and give it to tillers. These tillers, these landless laborers and sharecroppers, give legitimacy to the Naxal movement. But again, we see it as a law and order problem. We try to repress the Naxals, the police comes in, tries to repress the Naxals and these tillers, oppression happens, and further the cycle of Naxalism starts. And lastly, there is forest land. Now, in the tribal way of life, and I will talk about this in detail in just a minute, in the tribal way of life, the idea of development is very different from our idea of economic prosperity. For them, development is not merely an economic exercise. For them, the forest is a customary relationship that they have to maintain. But what do? We come up with laws like the Forest Conservation Act. We come up with the Indian Forest Act. And their traditional rights on the forest, right? Understand that they had earlier full rights of the forest. They now become concessions to forest land, that we are allowing you to do this. So from rights over forest, they go to concessions over the forest. Also, through laws like Forest Conservation Act and the apathy of the forest bureaucracy, these people who are living in harmony with the forest are displaced. Their customary idea of forest lands and customary forest rights, where they used to use the forest for their livelihood, is now gone. So they have lost their main economic and spiritual connection with the forest. So what has happened here? A governance vacuum is created. A developmental vacuum is created. This developmental vacuum is occupied by, again, the Naxals. And they promise to them, whether it is possible or not is a different story, but the Naxals promise that we will get you back into the forest. And this becomes the third driver in terms of Naxalism. Okay. So the first driver of Naxalism is land, and it is understood like this in terms of government, private, and forest land. Now, when you will want to go back to forest land through the use of violence, you will face either the forest bureaucracy or you will face the police. Now, under the threat of the Naxals, the forest bureaucracy decides that they are not going to act because they are afraid of this violent repression from the Naxals. So what happens? Even the legitimate rights are not enforced. When police repression happens, it is very difficult for the police to identify who is a Naxal and who is a common citizen who is giving legitimacy to the Naxals. So repression happens on both. And again, police repression and bureaucratic apathy becomes a driver of Naxalism. Now we've understood one topic, which is land. Let's continue. Now, the other, and actually the last dimension of land, is the idea. I should not rub this, I'll just zoom this out. This was also the question. The other dimension of land is that these are mineral rich regions. So there is an industrial interest to get the tribals out of this region and to think that if we get the tribals out, we'll give them good homes, we'll give them good forests, rather we'll give them good agricultural fields, we'll give them economy, please go out, we have to mine this land. Here let us try and understand the tribal way of life. So there is a tribe called the Birhor and there is a tribe called the Chenchu. Now these are hunting gathering tribes, and throughout their lives they have done hunting gathering. The government thinks that we will remove them from their places of their residence because there are minerals here. Once we remove them from their places of residence, we will mine the minerals. And because we are removing them from their places of residence, what we will do is we will give them agricultural fields, we will give them agricultural seeds, and we will give them plow. Seems fair enough. We'll give them fields, seeds, and a plow. They can carry on their agriculture in a different place. The problem here is not understanding the tribal way of life. Birhors and Chenchus are hunter-gatherer tribes, and they are afflicted, or rather they are also impacted by their own history, like we all are. Since their lifestyle is of hunting gathering, and they have a customary relationship with the forest, customary relationship with Mother Earth and land. One, they will never plow the land. That is why they don't do agriculture. Why will they not plow the land? Because they consider it sacred. Then, since they are hunter-gathering tribes, they will never live in houses, because they think that if they live under a house, the roof might collapse and fall on them. Now, this might seem like a superstition to you, but we all have superstitions. I am a Hindu and I tie a Rakhi to my sister. That's also a superstition. It's ultimately just a piece of thread. So it is their thinking that this house, if I live in this concrete house, it will fall on my head. They cannot plow the field. They cannot live in the house. They eat the seeds that are given to them because it is food, and they burn the wooden plow for firewood. So very famously in the Constituent Assembly, tribal leaders had said, what is for us in your development? Because we do not understand the tribal way of life, and we try to impose on them our idea of development. So effectively now the first driver of Naxalism, land in terms of government land, private land, forest land and mineral rich land is done. हमने land के साथ एक key issue देखा of displacement. Now this displacement is the second driver of Naxalism. Why? Landless laborers and tribals, rather tribal landless laborers, are displaced from the forest. Now they have no recourse. They cannot get back to their area of living. What is their possible recourse now? They can go to the government and ask for rehabilitation. But in the Khaka committee report, and I'll talk about that also, it says that 40% of the people that have been displaced in India through developmental projects are tribals themselves. They are only 7% of our population, 7 to 8%. But 40% displacement is happening of tribals. So they are bearing an undue burden of development-induced displacement. Now the recourses is they can go to government to rehabilitate them, which is not happening. They can go to another forest. But here there is the problem of forest bureaucracy. And they can go to other states. Ab. This developmental vacuum must be clear to you. यहाँ मैं समझाता हूँ. Government could not rehabilitate them. Forest bureaucracy has apathy for the tribals because there is no tribal welfare cadre in India. When they go to other states, a unique problem comes. If they are in the scheduled tribes list, और ये आपके prelims में भी पूछा है इस बार, if they are in the scheduled tribes list, they are a scheduled tribe only in their own state, not in the other state. So there is a Samatha tribe in Odisha. They go to AP, Andhra Pradesh, because of this development. But the benefits that were given, right? Benefits that were given to them as ST status in Odisha do not apply in Andhra Pradesh. So again, a governance vacuum is created. This governance vacuum is fulfilled by the left-wing extremists. And this becomes another driver of Naxalism. Now, when you are displaced from your area of living, if you are displaced, what do you lose first? After displacement, you will lose your livelihood. So what happens to the livelihood of the tribals? They are forced laborers in construction sites. They move on to other areas where they do not have education and they are socially excluded. And even in areas where they are working, the Minimum Wages Act should be implemented. In the Minimum Wages Act, for example, if I am your employer, I have to give you a minimum wage. But the jobs that the tribals are doing do not have employers. Things like someone is making pots, or things like someone is collecting tendu leaves. This is an interesting case study and I'll talk about it. Now, what does the government say? Or what does our constitution say? If you are a forced laborer, is there a fundamental right against it? ये आप मुझे comments में बताओगे. If you are socially excluded, is there a right against untouchability, and is there an SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act? And when you are working like this, you must get a minimum wage. But यहाँ पर तो minimum wage apply नहीं हो सकता. Article 23 is not implemented properly. SC/ST Act is not implemented properly. This making of pots and tendu leaves, since it doesn't fall under the Minimum Wages Act, they do not get wages for it. Whenever they fall under the Minimum Wages Act, even this is not implemented. Now, in yellow, if you would have noticed, I am always writing the reasons for the creation of a developmental and governance vacuum. This developmental vacuum is then occupied by the left-wing extremists. And how do they occupy this developmental vacuum? Here, in 1980s in Karimjar, there is Naxal violence against forced labor and forced labor stops. So these forced laborers then give legitimacy to the left-wing extremism doctrine. We'll talk of untouchability and social exclusion in detail. But when this happens, Minimum Wages Act, making pots, not connecting tendu leaves and not getting enough money, then Naxals introduce a concept of fair wage, which is not obviously scientifically determined, but through violent means they ensure that people who are working here get a fair wage from industrialists. Creation of developmental vacuum, Naxals fill the developmental vacuum, and then what happens? Legitimacy of the Naxal movement grows. So this idea of not getting enough livelihood and economic remuneration becomes another driver of Naxalism. Now, we were talking of this social exclusion. Let's talk again of social exclusion. With social exclusion, let's also talk of psychological exclusion. The tribals or the scheduled tribal communities are discriminated against by the upper castes. And I am not going into the details of this discrimination because बहुत ही खराब है. It is particularly bad, right? Things like they are not allowed to wear shoes, they have to bow down against the lower caste, against the upper caste, even very derogatory practices against women. This discrimination happens. Because of this discrimination, they feel alienated. And it is ultimately the state's responsibility to fulfill this alienation through Article 17, through Article 23, through the SC/ST Act. But it is not enforced. When it is not enforced, when these things do not happen, it leads to the creation of a developmental and governance vacuum. Now, ideally, there was also something else that was done to uplift the psychological state of the people living, let's say, in 5th scheduled areas. That was the 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act of giving them powers and be responsible for their own governance. But even here, devolution does not happen properly. 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act has to give them powers, has to give them devolution of finances, right? This is not implemented properly, and it also comes in conflict. We'll talk about PESA also. PESA also comes in conflict, although not to a large extent, with their traditional power structures. But this is also not implemented well. Now, in yellow, we can see the governance deficit. Now, imagine and just put yourself in the shoes of a tribal who is in this situation. You are constantly being harassed. Women in your community are not being given the dignity that they deserve. You do not have exclusion with the larger society, inclusion with the larger society. And then comes along a movement which says that if you pick up a gun, even the biggest landlord in the village, even the most higher caste in the village, everyone who is powerful or deemed to be powerful in the village is going to be scared of you. So tribals see that their own youth that have gone to this movement are picking up guns, and now the quote unquote big men of the village are scared of them. So psychologically, Naxalism becomes an empowering tendency, and it leads to legitimacy of this violent terrorist movement. This social exclusion and psychological exclusion of the lower rung of our society becomes another driver for Naxalism. Now, Naxals have, or rather tribals have, largely lived in the forest. We have understood this. And I have talked about the apathy of the forest bureaucracy. But let us look at that in detail. Let us look at misgovernance and maladministration. Now, there is something very, very unique about the Forest Conservation Act, at least in that times. A lot of these things have been corrected now, and I'll show you how. It says that if you are grazing your cattle in the forest, it is allowed. But if your cattle go and eat plants from the nurseries of the forest department, it is a crime. The act says that you can collect dry twigs and fallen logs from the forest, but if you cut standing timber, it is a crime. Now, these things are so close to each other that in this case, the person who is the regulator has a lot of discretion, and this discretion is used to the disadvantage of the tribals through harassment. Now, when this harassment happens, what is created? A governance deficit, a developmental deficit. Then comes along a violent movement that says that through violence, we are going to scare these people straight and get you back your rights on the forest. This gives further legitimacy to the doctrine of left-wing extremism, and maladministration and misgovernance by the forest bureaucracy becomes another driver of left-wing extremism. Now, let's go forward. Whenever there is dispute in the village, disputes happen in villages, let's say, with regards to land or with regards to some personal disputes. Where do people go for grievance redressal? The judicial system seems alien to them and does not guarantee a quick response. So these tribals and landless laborers decide either to go to caste panchayats or decide to go to the big landlords in the village. Right? When they go to the caste panchayat or they go to the big landlords in the village, usually the dispute is not settled in their favor. This creates, yet again, because the judicial system is not accessible, these disputes are being decided arbitrarily, creates a governance vacuum. Now, who fills this governance vacuum? It is the same actors. Left-wing extremists come, and the CPI Maoist decides to run people's courts. In these people's courts, justice is not delivered. Disputes are usually always settled for the weaker party. Disputes are settled quickly. They do not actually do proper justice because they are terrorists. They cannot govern. But they get legitimacy. They use violence. They do not settle these disputes properly. It leads to growth of and legitimacy of left-wing extremism because people think that they will listen to us. Now, last dimension that we have to discuss is what I have been talking about, is police repression. Now, police repression should not be understood to mean that our police has a problem. The problem is with the movement. How do you understand who is a Naxal and who isn't? How do you differentiate? It is a very difficult task. So when police are acting against the Naxals, inevitably, even certain innocent people, or rather, certain tribals who are giving them support, should not call them innocent, are also repressed. Right? In this process, they develop a lack of faith with the police. They don't think that the police will understand or address their grievances. So in this process, again, a governance deficit is created, which is then fulfilled by the Naxal movement. Right? This becomes another driver. Now, when the Naxal movement flourishes in any state or in any region, what happens? When the Naxal movement is flourishing, let's say Naxalism is flourishing, what will they do? One, honest and important government employees like doctors and teachers cannot now come to that region because they are scared for their life. Naxals do not let the government lay down infrastructure. Why? Because they think if infrastructure is laid down, more police and armed battalions can come to this region. Okay. They also don't let the government make schools because they think that at night, central armed police forces will set up camps in these schools and kill these Naxals. There are no doctors and teachers. Infrastructure is not being developed. Schools are not being made. What does this lead to? Another governance deficit because of the Naxals, and then reinforced into the Naxals. This is the vicious cycle of Naxalism that our eastern states have been stuck by for a very long time. So now we have completed the idea of drivers of Naxalism. अब आपका content देखते हैं. Just the drivers, not what the movement is, not where they are present, not the stats, not the evolution, just the drivers. Socio-economic issues like livelihood, unresolved issues, and exploitation. Land issues like land disputes, failure of land reforms, and other land-related factors. Displacement from the forest and forced evictions. Governance issues with regards to inadequate governance and governance-related factors. Police and state repression. Social exclusion. Psychological empowerment. Now it is your job to just read this once. Nothing is written here that I have not explained to you in depth and that you would not understand or be able to memorize. Okay. Now we have understood the drivers of Naxalism. This will make us understand what is Naxalism, or rather what is left-wing extremism. Why is it called left-wing extremism and not given any other name? So, there is a three-pronged strategy that the left-wing extremists use. It is 3 Ds. Disaffection against the state. Disinformation. Through the raising of issue of displacements. I will explain all 3 of these. With these 3 ideas in their head, they are carrying out a protracted, this is directly from the Ministry of Home Affairs website, People's War against the Indian state. And their objective is to cause, their objective is to have a radical political, economic, and social change by overthrowing the government, by extinguishing the capitalist system, and establishing a parallel government with a communist ideology. Now, this movement started in the Naxalbari district, which we will read about just now. And they are heavily influenced by the idea of Mao Zedong, the former leader of China. This reason is why they are called left-wing extremists. This reason is why they are called Naxals. And this reason is why they are called Maoists. They are the same, but there are 3 terms. Now let's understand disaffection, disinformation, and displacement in detail. So, the first idea is of disaffection. They highlight governance and developmental vacuums. They also are involved in the killing of lower ranked government officials. They show that disaffection means basically enmity, hate against the state. So they highlight this governance and deficit vacuum and they kill lower ranked police officials. What does that lead to? That leads to people losing their faith and trust in the state. Once this is done, they will form front organizations. These front organizations will operate in urban areas, in universities, with intellectuals. And they will show Naxalism in a proper light. So they will hide their violent nature using these front organizations. Okay. Now, lastly, there is the idea of displacement. Because their major grievance with the state and their major rallying point is the displacement of tribals and landless laborers that is happening in India. The idea is of a protracted people's war with disaffection, disinformation, and displacement. Movement started in Naxalbari, influenced by Mao's ideology. They want a radical political, economic, and social change, overthrow the government, remove the capitalist system, run a parallel administration with a communist ideology. This is the movement. So now let's come back. We started with what we have to read about Naxalism. We have understood what is Naxalism. We have understood the drivers of Naxalism. Now the government of India has a national policy and action plan. And all of this is in your notes, but I would want you to scribble down with me. National policy and action plan to deal with Naxals. And I think this is a very beautifully framed document because it speaks of 3 things, right? Firstly, if there is lack of development, it needs to be fulfilled by the state. But if someone is picking up a gun against the state, they are ultimately terrorists and we cannot sympathize with them. So security is also a component of our anti-left-wing extremism strategy. And ultimately, we have to ensure that the rights of the tribals that have been alienated must be restored. Right? So, it is essentially a three-pronged approach. On the top, we will write security to deal with illegitimate demands and illegitimate terrorists who are picking up guns against India. The legitimate grievances must be addressed through development. Right? And what will be the third component? Their political demands must be addressed. So their social and economic grievances of development have to be addressed. Their political demands have to be addressed. But if someone is picking a gun against the state, they are terrorists. We cannot sympathize with them, and we will lead to a security solution for them. Correct? This is the government of India's approach. Now, I am writing down a few keywords that I would want you to write with me for this problem. Now, for the security problem, we need both a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. In the top-down approach, what do we want? We want that armies, or let's say experienced forces such as CRPF, should be involved so that the states that do not have the capacity to deal with Naxalism should be addressed. Now, जब हम national security doctrine पढ़ रहे थे, we read about the fact that states' capacity is lacking. Accountability on the state's part is missing. To enforce this, we have to have a top-down approach. And the bottom-up approach comes at the local policing level, where we must do what? Allow rural policing by panchayats to empower them so that there is no harassment. Next. Security personnel are also afraid of their own safety. At this point, we must give them the ability to implement quick fix solutions when it comes to their own security. We must win the hearts and minds of the Naxal affected citizens, not only look at it as a security problem. We need to have a low-key level strategy. Low-key level strategy means going gradually. The idea here is to clear the area of Naxals, hold the area, and then develop it. Clear, hold, and develop. Not the idea of hammer and tongs approach. Hammer and tongs means that I go all out against Naxalism and try to destroy it. Hammer and tongs is what was done in Sri Lanka against the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. We don't need to do this. We don't need to have a knee-jerk approach. We need to have a low-key developmental and security strategy. Clear, holding, and develop. This is our basic idea. Quick fix solutions for the safety of government personnel. Both a top-down and a bottom-up approach. Right? Fix the accountability in the states, because ultimately public order is in the second list. Now let us understand what the government has actually done. So we've read the drivers. We'll now come to what we have done to counter left-wing extremism. Now, since this is factual, I would want you to study it directly from the PDF. So we have countered Naxalism first through physical infrastructure, because infrastructure in the economy has a multiplier effect. Wherever there is infrastructure, development happens. Infrastructure is sine qua non for development. So let's see what we have done. We have a special infrastructure scheme where we construct fortified police stations, and this scheme has been extended till 2026. We have a LWE mobile tower project by the Department of Telecom. So they are establishing mobile towers in left-wing extremism affected areas. And recently they have decided to upgrade these from 2G towers to 4G towers. Now, there is something called the Universal Service Obligation Fund. This is levied on the adjusted gross revenue of telecom companies. You must have read this in your prelims in economy. From this USOF, we support the scheme of mobile connectivity in uncovered aspirational districts, which also include LWE districts. We have Netra. Netra is an unmanned aerial vehicle used by the CRPF for surveillance. We have assistance to central agencies for the management of left-wing extremism. For example, helicopters being given to the CAPF for management. We have done GIS mapping. Through the GIS, we have mapped important infrastructural points like schools, post offices, health facilities, and roads, so that the Naxals can't counter this, not target these. Then we have rail services being established in Chhattisgarh and specifically in Bastar, which is one of the most Naxal afflicted districts of our country. Then we have the road connectivity project for the left-wing extremism affected districts by the Ministry of Rural Development. And we have the road requirement plan under which 8 critical bridges have been constructed. In terms of institutional measures, there is a security-related expenditure scheme. The government understands that states do not have the financial capacity to spend so much on their security. So whenever it comes to either ex gratia payments of martyrs, training, and community policing, the states and their expenditure is reimbursed by the central government. Then there is a unified command set up in the states of Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, and Odisha and West Bengal. Why this unified command, I will just explain to you. Then there is a special central assistance for most LWE affected districts. 30 most LWE affected districts are getting this assistance to fill critical infrastructure gap. Then we have a civic action program. Civic action is to bridge the gaps between the security forces and the local people through personal interaction, because this alienation, this lack of faith with the police is a problem that we need to now solve. Vacuum areas are those areas where we don't have a security presence. So we have established joint task forces and CAPF camps. And we have banned the CPI Maoist under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. And the Ministry of Home Affairs has issued a special standard operating procedures document when it comes to improvised explosive devices or explosive being used by the Naxals. Now, in terms of security forces, we have the Black Panther forces, the Cobra Battalion, the Bastaria Battalion, and these examples you need to remember: Operation Anaconda in Jharkhand, C-60 force in Gadchiroli. And even in this map, you can see this from your document, these special forces have been labeled. So if you get a question directly on security measures, you need to make this map in your answer. Now, Naxalism was also a social problem. So we have a tribal youth exchange program organized by Nehru Yuva Kendra Sangathan. We have a Roshni scheme for digital literacy and mentorship. We have a Going Online as Leaders initiative by Facebook, targeting specifically tribal youth. Livelihood colleges are being made for vocational training. Eklavya model residential schools, as you have very rightly mentioned in the chat. We also have 11 LWE districts that did not have Kendriya Vidyalayas earlier have now been sanctioned by the Ministry of Education. And this I need you to write down and add, that there is a skill development scheme of the Ministry of Skill Development to set up ITIs and skill development centers in this region. The Ministry of Finance is providing them with banking correspondents. The Honorable Prime Minister has launched the Particularly Vulnerable Tribal Groups Development Mission. This is development. And we are also following measures like rubber cultivation in Andhra Pradesh. Okay. Now you must have seen that our approach is not merely a security-based approach. It is a multi-pronged approach where we are dealing with various layers. We are talking of infrastructure, we're talking of social measures, we're trying to restore the alienated rights, and we're also focusing on security. Hammer and tongs means to go all out. ये नक्सल security problem है, I will go all out and destroy it. That is what hammer and tongs means. Having a security approach that essentially the Sri Lankan government had against the LTTE. कि ये लोग terrorists हैं, मुझे सबको मार देना है. This is hammer and tongs. What Israel is doing in Palestine is also a sort of hammer and tongs approach. Now, let us now read, or rather let us now understand, what can we do to counter Naxalism like it was asked as a multi-pronged strategy. In this multi-pronged strategy, we need to understand various stakeholders and what various stakeholders will do. So we have to understand what security personnel are going to do, what administrative institutions are going to do, what civil society can do. In administrative, institutional measures, and administrative personnel, both what they are going to do. And we also have to understand what local bodies must do. अब मैं आपसे एक चीज पूछता हूं, did you think in the original Naxal idea, the 3 Ds, we have to think with those 3 Ds in mind. When it comes to security forces, we need specialized forces. तभी मैं उस टेबल को आपको एक्सप्लेन नहीं कर रहा था, because now I will explain it. Things like greyhounds, things like C-60 special forces, these are specialized battalions made simply to deal with the problem of Naxalism, and these specialized battalions need to be made. Then, security forces also have a developmental job. So they have to assist the local administration in running of schools and hospitals. Security forces must also focus on winning the hearts and the minds of the LWE doctrine affected citizens. Now, this local administration helping run schools and hospitals is an example that was seen in West Bengal. तो जो हमने वहां पर एग्जांपल्स देखे थे, greyhounds, C-60 special forces, these are specialized battalions to deal with Naxalism, because the Naxal strategy of warfare is what? They are actually guerrilla armies. Where does this word come from? This word comes from the name of Che Guevara, who was a Latin American guerrilla warfare leader, who says that you must hide. They can't fight in a uniformed conflict with the Indian state. It cannot be Naxals are standing on that side, police is standing on this side. Indian police is much better equipped, right? But they are hiding in the forest. They will ambush. They will plant mines. This is what they will do. So to deal with such guerrilla tactics, we need specialized police battalions. But police battalions and army battalions not only have to deal with the security problem, they also have to help in development. They also have to win the hearts and minds of people. Now, when it comes to our administration, we have to do infrastructural development and address the legitimate grievances. Now, when you are writing this answer and you see infrastructure development and addressing of grievances, write the schemes that we read. Security related expenditure scheme, special central assistance scheme, special infrastructure scheme. That is why I wasn't explaining this, but here it will help you put it in context. Okay. Then with regards to administrative personnel, institutions of course also have to do monitoring and evaluation of their programs. Now with regards to administrative personnel, the problem is that people who are posted in these tribal districts look at it as a punishment posting. The idea is to get out of here as soon as possible. Here I would like to mention one of my batchmates. His name is Tanmay. He is in the IS. he filled the Chhattisgarh cadre very high on his preference list because he told me that he wanted to work in the tribal regions. I have never met such an idealistic man before. And when you will fill your DAF, you will also think to put Chhattisgarh low. I also did it. ये हमारी टेंडेंसी ही है कि ट्राइबल पोस्टिंग जो है वो एक पनिशमेंट पोस्टिंग है, यहाँ क्यों जाना, राइट? बट इससे प्रॉब्लम क्या होती है? यहां पर फिर आती है ब्यूरोक्रेटिक एपैथी. When good people will not go from the bureaucracy to this region, then what will happen? There will be no good proper governance. So इसके दो solutions हैं. एक तो we don't view this as punishment postings and it needs to be incentivized. The other solution is that officers who are from that state, उनके लिए तो this is their local area, they want to serve here, they must be given opportunities to come to premier institutes like Labasna, get exposure, learn, and then it will lead to better administration in those areas. Now, what does the civil society need to do? The main job of the civil society is to act as a bridge between the extremist doctrine affected citizens and the government. Also, what the civil society needs to do is to combat the information warfare that the Naxals are waging. Here, we need to educate the common citizens against the Naxal idea and against the problems of violence. Then, in the local bodies, what is needed is the empowerment of tribals, the correct implementation and following of the provisions of PESA, 5th schedule, the Forest Rights Act. Now, I have not made this up myself. These are the direct recommendations of the 2nd Administrative Reforms Commission and the latest Ministry of Home Affairs annual report. So you can quote all of these directly, and in your notes, it is written, segregated with giving you the sources, so that if you get a question, you can write multi-pronged strategy was asked before. If it is asked, you can write as discussed in the 2nd ARC report and the latest MHA annual report. These things need to be done. I have only told you what has been written here. When you are writing, you must quote this to show the examiner that you have read well. Now, if a way forward is asked for Naxalism, a way forward is asked for the problem of Naxalism, we will write Naxalism only. So with N, we will write about negotiated settlements. Right? With A, we will write about administrative mechanisms. Administrative mechanisms may making the same changes that we have just listed. With X, we will write extension and implementation of the legal framework, things like Forest Rights Act, PESA, etc. With A again, we will write augmenting the security forces. Augmenting means to enhance the security forces. With L, we will write learning and sensitization of the bureaucracy to tribal problems. Then, with I, we will write proper implementation and monitoring of schemes. With S, we will write that we need to strengthen the local police. And with M, we will write we need to maximize two things. One, infrastructure, and two, security of that infrastructure. So if you get a way forward to be written, you write like this. One thing you need to add to this way forward, right, is the Samadhan strategy. Samadhan is a common answer now. Everybody writes it. I will teach you, but I will recommend that you write from second ARC. Okay. Now, what is Samadhan? This way forward is also suggested by the second ARC in the MHA annual report. And this mnemonic is here also. N say negotiations for conflict resolution. The Samadhan strategy is an 8-pointed strategy for fighting left-wing extremism in India, given by the Ministry of Home Affairs. With S, it says smart leadership. A says aggressive strategy. M says motivation and training. A says actionable intelligence. D says dashboard-based KPIs. Now, what is KPI? KPI is key performance indicator. So we will have some key performance indicators like poverty rate in these districts, implementation of FRA in this district, etc. H says we must harness technology. A says we must have an action plan for each theater. And N says no access to financing. This is the government's own strategy. Rather than writing this, which everyone is going to write, you can mention this and write the way forward like I have shown you. Don't miss Samadhan, but write it like this. वहां नक्सलिज्म मत बना देना उसको, है ना? This is for you to remember. I hope that is clear. Up. Now we will read two more things. First, we will read about the evolution of the movement. I'll just take you back to where we started. So now, क्या क्या कर लिया हमने और क्या क्या रह गया वो देखते हैं. We have done the drivers of the Naxal movement. We have done countering left-wing extremism. We have done the government of India's approach. We have done the multi-pronged strategy and way forward. We have understood what this movement is and why it is called left-wing extremism. What we have not done is evolution of the movement. And linked to this is the case of Salwa Judum that we have not done. After doing these two things, we will read about fifth schedule and forest policy, and then we will read some case studies. Let's read the evolution. Ab dekho. Evolution is mainly for your understanding. Okay, it's mainly for your understanding. Why? Because it is unlikely that this evolution will be asked. But we will read it still. The first phase of Naxalism was 1969 to 72. What happens here? In the Naxalbari district of West Bengal, a youth is protesting with the idea is that he wants to plow his own land and he is protesting. Police comes down harshly on him and he is assaulted. Then a further protest happens. And this protest, unfortunately, is fired upon by the police. It was not a very peaceful protest, but firing happens. And from here, this spark starts. Now, there is a person by the name of Charu Majumdar who becomes the leader of this movement and forms the CPI-ML. CPI is Communist Party of India. This person then starts this movement and it becomes very rapidly a violent movement. It spreads to West Bengal, Bihar, Andhra Pradesh and Kolkata. And even in urban Kolkata, why? Because there is a tendency to form fronts. Correct? How is the movement suppressed in the first phase? The government of that time crushes the movement. Charu Majumdar is arrested and killed. The movement is suppressed. For 3 years at this time, India is under emergency. So whoever were the people who were sponsoring this movement or were supporting this movement go to jail. But the emergency is finally lifted. And the second phase of the movement starts. When the emergency is lifted, these leaders come out of jail. Right? What happens? That once the emergency is lifted, the Naxalite movement starts again. And 4 main factions emerge. One is the MCC, which is the Maoist Communist Center. One is PWG, which is the People's War Group. There is Party Unity and there is CPI-ML Liberation Faction. ये डिटेल में पढ़ने की जरूरत नहीं है, इस पे क्वेश्चन बहुत अनलाइकली है, हमें बस बेसिक पता होना चाहिए. नाउ द CPI-ML liberation decides to participate in elections and go for democracy. But the other three factions decide to do what? Have a violent conflict. तो जिन CPI के MPs के बारे में आप पढ़ते हो, they are from that part of CPI that has gone for democracy. बाकी दूसरा CPI कैसे बना, CPI Maoist कैसे बना, हम अभी देखेंगे. So three factions remain: Maoist Communist Center, People's War Group, and Party Unity. Now, in 1998, Party Unity merges with People's War Group and forms CPI-ML People's War. That was CPI-ML Liberation. They formed CPI-ML People's War. Now, there are two factions. One is Maoist Communist Center. One is CPI-ML People's War. ये दो factions बच गई. Right? CPI-ML Liberation has gone to fight the elections. They are no longer a violent outfit, so they contest elections normally. At this time, MCC is operating in Bihar and Jharkhand, PWG in northern Telangana. Right? Up. The third phase happens when these three groups, Party Unity, MCC, and PWG, all three, the remaining three violent factions, merge together and form the CPI Maoist. This is the organization that was banned under UAPA. CPI Maoist then has a unified command structure, and it leads to a lot of deaths and a lot of violence. This was the peak of the Naxal movement. Now, at this time, the government launches Salva Judum. We'll read about Salva Judum. And in 2010, Maoists kill 75 CRPF personnel in Dantewada in a major incident leading to the death of many political leaders also. After this, the government starts suppressing this movement, and the fourth phase starts, where the levels of violence start declining through successful counter-insurgency efforts. Now, either they are successful efforts of counter-insurgency and development, or it is possible that the Maoists are in strategic retreat and they might come back. But from the stats that we will read, we will understand that counter-insurgency is working, and with development and security are going together, and this movement is starting to show a downward trend, which was the previous question. Now, why is it showing a downward trend? This is the statistics related to Naxal violence. You can read this, I would expect that you would read, but you will see that there has been a decline in violent incidents. 77% they have declined compared to their peak in 2010. 2010 was that Dantewada incident. And even the casualties have reduced by 90%. In 2010, it was 1005 at the peak of the moment. And in 2022, it was 98. So from 1005, the casualties because of Naxalism have come down to 98. Now this data should go into your answers. This incidentally is the first time in a lot of years when Naxal related deaths are less than 100. Now, I will expect that you will read this data once, extract 2 or 3 points that are relevant and keep them in your notes. Now let us understand this map. This map talks about the emerging areas of Naxal threat. The idea of the CPI is to establish a red corridor from here, ideally till here in India, and run this as a parallel government. Of course, they are not even remotely capable of this. So the red corridor, this idea of red corridor is shrinking. Now, why red? Red is the color of communism. This is why the Chinese flag is also red. The flag of USSR is also red. Any communist country in the world will have red on its flag. Right? So they wanted a red corridor in India. Shrinking, this corridor is shrinking because of the valiant and brave efforts of our armed forces. But there are new areas emerging. One is JCO, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Odisha Tri-Junction. One is MMC, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh Tri-Junction. One is KKT, Karnataka, Kerala and Tamil Nadu Tri-Junction. Now, why only in these Tri-Junctions? Because law and order was a state subject. And at the state boundaries, one police jurisdiction stops, second police jurisdiction starts. And when there is a confluence of three states, at that area, there is a lack of accountability with respect to who is going to ensure security in this region. So at that time, in those areas, Naxalism flourishing, right? Now, the CPI is a very ambitious but very incapable organization. They cannot fight with the Indian state, but इनके ambitions बहुत ज़्यादा हैं. तो इन्होंने कहा that we will make from Pune to Ahmedabad in this region a golden corridor. अपना संभल नहीं रहा है इनसे और ज्यादा दिन की कहानी बची नहीं है इनकी, but they have proposed a golden corridor, so we will use this keyword if we need it. Now, the problem is here. In the north, they are going for an urban movement also. One thing that we now have to read is Salva Judum. Right? So we will understand the case of Salva Judum in detail. Evolution हो गया, अब यहां से चलते हैं Salva Judum पे. What happened in the case of the Salva Judum? The Salva Judum was effectively a civil militia or a civilian based militia to fight against left-wing extremism. Civilians and young people with not a lot of training were given weapons and were said that you need to fight left-wing extremism at the local level. Okay. Now, this was made. It was shown that this is a spontaneous uprising against Naxalism, but it is now believed not to be so. And what happened here is that since these people were not trained well, it led to a lot of massacres. It led to a lot of human rights violations. And ultimately, the Supreme Court said that Salva Judum is unconstitutional. Okay. Now, why was Salva Judum deemed as unconstitutional? Okay. So, this was the Nandini Sundar case. One second. This was in the Supreme Court. Nandini Sundar and others versus Union of India. है आपके notes में. Now, what was said in the Nandini Sundar case? In the Nandini Sundar case, Supreme Court made few observations. Firstly, it said, देखो, जो ये सलवा जुदुम में रिक्रूटमेंट हो रही थी, ये क्यों हो रही थी? This Salva Judum recruitment was happening as special police officers under the Chhattisgarh Special Police Act. Now, this act was not detailed enough about the appointment of these SPOs. So the Supreme Court said that this is too much delegation from the legislature to the executive, and it is unacceptable. The second case was the conditions of appointment of SPOs themselves, on the conditions on how they were being appointed. And lastly, the case was with regards to the rights of the SPOs. Now, rights of SPOs is most important because these were youth who were fighting as policemen. They were doing the job of a police officer, but they were not getting a proper salary. They were not getting pension benefits. All they were getting was an honorarium. So the Supreme Court said this is violative of which article of the Constitution? ये आप बताओ. This idea of someone doing this job but not getting the emoluments of this job. If I was a normal police officer, I was doing the same job, I was getting salary and pensions. Here I am doing the same job, I am not getting salary and pensions. Which article is being violated? Right to equality. This is one person, he is doing job A. This is one person, he is also doing job A. To one person, you give salary, pension benefits, life insurance. To the other person, you just give an honorarium, some payment, थोड़ी बहुत पैसे. This is violative of right to equality. It was also violative of their right to life, since they were put in dangerous situations. So in Nandini Sundar versus Union of India, Supreme Court says Salva Judum is unconstitutional. We read a PYQ saying that non-implementation of fifth schedule is leading to left-wing extremism. Correct? ऐसा एक PYQ देखा था हमने, है ना? Tell me the features of the fifth schedule. Features of fifth schedule. बताओ. देखो, अगर हमें ये चीज टॉपिक पढ़ना है तो पहले फीचर्स ऑफ फिफ्थ शेड्यूल, हाउ दे आर नॉट बीइंग इंप्लीमेंटेड, हाउ दैट नॉन इंप्लीमेंटेशन इज लीडिंग टू लेफ्ट विंग एक्सट्रीमिज्म. जब भी याद करना हो, रिमेंबर विद स्टेक होल्डर्स, what can the governor do? The governor can make special regulations with regards to peace, administration, good governance. The governor can send a report to the central government on how fifth schedule is being run. There is a provision for tribes advisory council with 20 members. 3/4 of them have to be STs. Laws that are implemented in the country can have certain exceptions, and these exceptions also have to be applied by the governor. And lastly, last provision चलो छोड़ देते हैं. अब ये सबने पढ़ा है कि governor can send a report to the center. This you have read, right? I hope you have read this. Now these are the provisions of the fifth schedule. Where is the problem? The problem is one here, that laws that are made in the country must be applied in fifth schedule after making necessary exceptions and modifications. But the governor's office does not have the capacity to make these exceptions, and therefore this provision is mechanistically applied. Any law is made, it is mechanistically applied to the fifth scheduled areas. Then center can give directions to the states. As per the Mungelkar Commission, in the last 50 years, no substantive direction has been given by the central government to any state with regards to directions that need to be implemented. Now, why is this happening? Because this report that has to come from the governor to the center is either very mechanistically and tokenistically made, or mechanical report होती है, उसमें कुछ ज़्यादा information नहीं है ढंग की. The other problem is that they are not regular in submitting these reports. Okay. And then there is responsibility of the governor to make special laws with regards to peace and good governance and administration. Here we have to talk about what? These laws have to deal with what? यहाँ लिख देता हूँ चलो. These laws have to deal with transfer of land from a tribal to a non-tribal one. They also have to deal with the practice of money lending in tribal areas. Transfer of land क्यों? Because land is a major driver for left-wing extremism, but it is often noted that there are still state laws that are in conflict with this provision and they have not been executed. Now, the Tribes Advisory Council is supposed to make recommendations to the governor, but the meetings are tokenistic and their recommendations are not discussed. This is the non-implementation of the fifth schedule. Non-implementation of fifth schedule is what? Governance vacuum. This governance vacuum then leads to left-wing extremism. This was the question. This is the answer. This is how you're supposed to write the answer in this manner. And I am not giving this data to you by myself. Whatever I have written on the board in yellow and in pink is the recommendation of compiled recommendation of 3 reports of the government. One is the Mungelkar Commission, one is the Bhuria Commission, and one is the Khaka Committee report. I have read these reports and extracted this data, so you can write this directly in your answer and you can mention these also. Even in the content that I've given you, when we come to this part, non-implementation of fifth schedule and leading to left-wing extremism, which is a previous year question, there is an idea. Here, we've read Salva Judum, for example. This is that part in your content. And here, provisions of fifth schedule are given, क्योंकि आपकी polity थोड़ी सी revise हो जाए. And this, how there is linkage of left-wing extremism with non-implementation of fifth schedule from the Mungelkar, Bhuria and Khaka committee reports. And you can quote these directly. And you can mention this in your answer, so the examiner thinks you are well read. Right? For example, if something is directly from Mungelkar Commission, it says Mungelkar Commission here. Okay, done. Now, let's get back to where we started from. There are now, this is done. We must read a few case studies now. Then we will read the issue of forest policy and some emerging issues. We will read with these case studies. तो चलो अब case studies पे आते हैं. I will give you these 2 case studies. They're already in your notes. यहीं से पढ़ा देता हूँ. Now this I want you to write down, although the basis of the case study is here, but I want you to write. ठीक है, थोड़ा सा लिखना. The first case study is of Naxalbari. What happened in Naxalbari was the movement started here. Okay, the movement started here, but what was the response? The government in response launches the Comprehensive Area Development Program. Along with this, Operation Barga is launched. Now, Bargadar is the term for sharecroppers. These sharecroppers are people who have not gotten the benefits of land reform, land being the first driver of left-wing extremism. They have not gotten these benefits, so the government does land reform with Operation Bargadar in West Bengal. The government then goes on to increase and implement the idea of minimum wages. The government cancels private debt of the tribals from moneylenders and provides them with formal loans from the bank. And ultimately, Naxalbari mein government launches Comprehensive Area Development Program. Operation Bargadar is launched. Land reform happens. Minimum wages are increased. Private debt from moneylenders is cancelled. Loans are provided from financial institutions like banks. And development happens. This development leads to removal or actually decline of extremism in this region. And Naxalbari, this is a case study given in the second ARC 7th report. This is a wonderful example of how development has led to coming down of extremism. Now, in comparison, let us read the case of Pavagada. In Pavagada, what happens is that the government implements welfare measures initially, but there is a complaint by the locals in that region that this particular welfare measures are directed towards politicians and the benefits are not coming to the desired tribals, but being cornered by some sections of the society. The government then, under these allegations, withdraws from the proactive role of development, and left-wing extremism re-emerges in this region. The government thinks that we will now redeploy these armed forces in these regions. But when these armed forces are redeployed, again the cycle of violence begins, and this government policy of getting development to Pavagada fails. Here what was happening was that the Naxals then start extorting money from this section of the society, not politicians, but the rich section of society, and they appear to the public as if they are redistributing this money. So they appear as messiahs. They get legitimacy, left-wing extremism re-emerges, again security forces have to be deployed, and development fails, and there is a re-emergence of left-wing extremism. So here are two examples of how development can be a solution to extremism, but distorted development can be a cause of extremism. This is also the fourth theme that we have to cover in this topic. Now, chalo. Let us now understand, come back to where we started from. We've read this case study. From this case study, let us read one or two emerging issues. One emerging issue is women coming to the red corridor. So let's read about women in the red corridor. Now, often when we think of the problem of Naxalism, we think of it as a male-dominated problem. We don't understand that even women are facing this brunt. So today what is happening, that more than 50% of the Naxal cadres meaning soldiers, are actually women. Why are the women coming here, one? Why are they here? What challenges do they face? And how do we address this problem? Let's go one by one. Why are they here? They are here because the repression that any man faces from the police force, if I am a man and a police person tries to repress me, I will at least, most likely, not face sexual violence. I might face violence of all kinds, but I will not face sexual violence most likely. But if I am a woman, I have a dual burden. I will face violence and I will also face sexual violence. Right? If there is a corrupt officer who wants to repress me, the maximum he can do to me as a man, I can face sexual violence, but it is much more likely that a woman will face sexual violence. So the dual burden of both violence and sexual repression is something women face. They are discriminated against in these regions. They do not get land rights. And then the Naxals are making specific pitch to the women by saying that their problems will be addressed. So, the Naxals have something called the Krantikari Adivasi Mahila Sangathan. And this is a specific women's organization meant to solve the problem of women in the Naxal inflicted regions. So there are push factors and there are pull factors leading women coming to the Naxal fold. What challenges are they facing? One, they are approximately 50 to 60% of the Naxal cadre, but they are 90% of the martyrs. So they are facing structural violence. They also have this problem of menstrual hygiene, reproductive health, problems of anemia, and most importantly, the Naxals are the worst scourge of humanity. So they are also facing the problems of sexual repression. %60 of Naxal cadres are women, 50 to 60%. But only one member in the 20-member central committee of the CPI Maoist is a woman. So they don't get representation. They are still facing sexual violence. They have this problem of reproductive health. They are facing structural violence also. So how do we address this problem? We have to understand first that this exists as a specific problem. We have to go for gender sensitive policies. And rather than trying to counter and beat these women cadres, we have to diminish their motivations. We have to understand what motivates them and then take away these motivating factors that are bringing them to the Naxal fold. Okay, now let's get back. The last thing that we have to read in Naxalism, and you will see this board again, what is Naxalism is done, evolution is done, drivers are done, countering is done with schemes, comprehensive survey of Government of India's approach is done, multi-pronged strategy is done, way forward is done, fifth schedule in Naxalism is done, Salva Judum is done, case studies are done. The only thing we are left with is the specifics of forest policy. And its interaction with Naxalism. And this is also a topic very, very important for environment. It might be asked in environment, there also you must give these dimensions. The tribal struggle in India can ultimately be summed up with 3 J's. There are 3 J's. Jal, meaning water. Zameen, meaning land. And the second J is jungle, meaning forest. It is actually a struggle for these 3 J's: Jal, Jungle, Zameen. So the forest plays a very important role because they are living in harmony with nature. Now let us see what the colonial government first, then the independent government after that, and the government in the recent past has done with our forest policy. So before 1855, when there was no forest policy in India, there was an idea that tribals would live in harmony with the forest. And they have absolute rights over the forest. And they were the ones who were actually conserving the forests also. Okay. But the colonial government comes and they look at forests only as a source of timber, since they have to finance their railways and their other developmental projects. So in 1855, the colonial government introduces the forest policy of 1855, where they say tribal rights are prohibited. Then they introduce the Forest Act of 1865, and they say that government is solely responsible for all assets in the forest. They also get the right to declare any particular land as a forest. So tribals start getting being pushed out of the forest. Here is where we read about colonial tribal revolts, outsiders coming to the forest and pushing them out. Then, the Forest Act in 1878 prohibits grazing and classifies forests into protected forests, reserve forests, and village forests. Then the Forest Policy of 1894 comes, and in 1894, a concept of eminent domain is introduced. And in eminent domain, it is said that if there is any public purpose, then for this public purpose, the government can acquire a forest, declare a land as forest, also deforest that particular forest. This, then, if you understand that earlier, before 1855, tribals had rights. and complete rights to the forest. Through these policies, these rights become privileges that we are allowing you. For example, it is your right to ask me a question. But if I say that I will only answer questions to those people who are living in Delhi, then it becomes a privilege to a specific class, right? So rights become privileges. Privileges, I am allowing you, I am giving you this right. It is not your right from birth. It is not inherent. Because I am benevolent, I am giving you this privilege. Rights of the tribals become privileges. Then in 1927, a law comes called the Forest Act, which is still in force, which then again divides forests into reserve, protected, and village forests, which is the classification even today. This act is also in force today, and it gives powers to the state government as well as powers to the forest bureaucracy to develop and control the forest. So these rights became privileges. After these privileges, you classify forests like this. You make a forest bureaucracy. So these privileges become concessions. Concessions means that this is not your privilege, this is not your right. I am just allowing you for a temporary period. Then, once this continues, there comes the forest policy of 1952, and it says that 33% of the land has to come under forest cover. Then the National Commission for Agriculture is formed, and it says that priority has to be given to the industrial needs of the forest, not to the tribal needs of the forest. The idea of the government of that day is that to conserve the forests, people living in the forest must be pushed out of the forest because they are practicing things like shifting cultivation, where they are burning and cutting the forests. Forests have to be pristine, reserved. Pristine मतलब उनको अलग से छोड़ देना है, जैसे हम अपनी कई किताबों के साथ करते हैं. Pristine, छुओ मत, मार्क मत करो, खोलो ही मत. Pristine. So they say that forests are pristine. They have to be kept away from any human influence. And the priority of the forest is our industrial needs. Then what happens? Then once we give this, we come with the Forest Conservation Act. With the National Commission of Agriculture recommendations and the Forest Conservation Act, we say that people have to be pushed out of the forest. The forests are national wealth. National wealth. How do I define nation is the key question here. National wealth, meaning wealth for our national industries to give us resources, ecosystem services. We have shallow ecology, right? Now what happens? It is realized that this target of 33% forest is not getting met. Even after all of these policies, we are not meeting it because it is then realized by the B.K. Roy Burman committee that it was actually the tribals who were in the forest and maintaining it also. When they were doing shifting cultivation, they did not slash and burn only. They used to shift after they had used that plot to let the forest regenerate. So then we realize that without tribals, we cannot conserve our forests. Then a change in policy happens. Forest policy of 1988 comes that for the first time recognizes the concept of joint forest management, recognizes the concept of sacred growth, that forests are sacred. Forests are sacred to the tribals. Then lastly, all of this historical injustice starting from 1855 is corrected in the Forest Rights Act of 2006, where we say that tribals have the rights to live in the forest, to live, use, develop, and conserve the forests. These rights are given in the Forest Rights Act. इतनी हिस्टोरिकल इनजस्टिसेस होने के बाद फाइनली द फॉरेस्ट राइट्स एक्ट हैपेंस. बट जो प्रॉब्लम हमने वहां पर क्रिएट कर दी थ्रू ऑल ऑफ दिस हिस्टोरिकल इनजस्टिस, through years and years of our policy, years and years of repression, of pushing tribals out, starting from 1855, going on till 2005, we have ensured that tribals are pushed out of the forest. This has led to their alienation. This has led to a governance vacuum. But now finally, we have the Forest Rights Act, where we have given them their rights back. But क्या उनकी problems, will they be ever the same? Will the tribals who have faced so much of historical injustice being pushed out of the forest, will that ever be same after the implementation of the FRA? No. Why? Because UPSC once said in its essay paper, you cannot step into the same river twice. Use this in the essay. Once I have made the mistake, it will create so many ripples that even if I wish to correct this mistake later, it will not be the same river again. It will have changed continuously because my mistake will have implications. Right? Okay. Up. Let's talk of the Forest Rights Act. The Forest Rights Act gives 4 types of rights. One is a title right for 4 hectares for the land that is already being cultivated. It gives rights till to, it is actually, I'll just tell you the entire name. The entire name of this act is Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Rights Act. To other traditional forest dwellers and to scheduled tribes who have been living in the forest till 13 December 2005, this is the cutoff date, it gives a few rights. The first right is title rights. So you can have titles. If you title means effectively a land deed. So this land deed guarantees that you have rights to the forest. 4 hectares for the land already being cultivated. It gives you right to use forest resources and extract minor forest produce, use grazing areas. It gives development rights. In case of any forced displacement or illegal eviction, there will be relief. And it gives responsibilities in the form of rights as forest management rights, where these dwellers are supposed to conserve the forest. Now, this is a definition of who can claim these rights. Prelims information hai. You can read from here if you've not already read. But this I don't need to explain because this is something that has you might have studied in the prelims if you've done the P by Q bell, and they will not ask this definitions, they'll ask the analysis, which we will read later. Now, it is ultimately the Gram Sabha that has the authority to initiate the process for determining the nature and extent of these rights. Why the Gram Sabha? Because for a person who has been living in the forest, our formal bureaucratic structure might be alien. So you go to only the Gram Sabha. You go to the Gram Sabha, they are people from your own community, and you get rights from there. Then there is a 3-tier structure. If the Gram Sabha is not able to solve, it goes to the SDM, then it goes to the district level commit. Now this Gram Sabha question has been asked before in the prelims. Now, what is the problem with the Forest Rights Act? This they can ask you. Firstly, there is a gap at the policy level. So it says rights will be given to people who primarily reside in the forest. This term is left undefined. Rights will be given to people who are using forest for their bona fide livelihood. This term bona fide livelihood is not defined. So this remains a matter which is not very clear. Then the position of primitive, vulnerable tribal groups, or particularly vulnerable tribal groups. If you don't know what this is, you should know ideally for prelims. These are groups. There is certain criteria to determine these groups. Do read about it. They don't have a high population. Their culture is almost extinct. There are conditions. You must read about PBTGs. It's a prelims topic. But their position in this Forest Rights Act is slightly unclear. Then it is in conflict. This law at the policy level is in conflict with the Forest Conservation Act and the Wildlife Protection Act, because you will make critical habitats, you will make no-go zones, you will make areas where people are not supposed to go under these laws, and you are also giving forest rights under a different law. So they come under conflict. This is a problem. Then this is a policy level problem. Then there are some other problems. There is a problem of implementation. If I am a tribal and I want to claim my title, where do I go? I have to go to the Gram Sabha. They will forward my request. It will be elevated. Ultimately, that request has to be cleared and a title has to come to me. But as per the data of the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, only 40% of the claims that have been made have been recognized so far. Then there is resistance from the Forest Department. This is the gap in implementation. Then there is a ground of claim rejection. How can my claim get rejected? This has been written in the Act. There are sections in the Act. But what are the grounds of rejection? Where the land is disputed, or there is wrong interpretation of the term other traditional forest dwellers. As per the Act, again, I'm not teaching you the provisions in detail, but I'll give them to you if you need them. OTFD is someone who stayed in the forest for 75 years. But there is again a conflict with regards to this definition and the implementation and interpretation of this definition. And then lastly, there is violation of the clauses of this Act. The Act says, till the process of recognition and verification is complete. Process of recognition and verification means I am a tribal, I have applied for rights. My rights need to be first recognized, verified, then title needs to be given to me. If I am rejected in this recognition and verification process, I can be removed from the forest. But before this process is complete, I will not be removed from the forest. This is what the Act says. But this is happening, that removal is happening, and here the example of Thane is also given. So you know what the reasons are of non-implementation, or rather I should say non-proper implementation of FRA. Now when the FRA is not implemented properly, this is the FRA, it's not implemented properly, it leads to what? A governance vacuum. And this ultimately then can become a cause for left-wing extremism. Thank you very much for your patient listening.